At my rehearsal dinner, 80 of Atlanta's most elite guests watched as my future mother-in-law slid a prenuptial agreement across the linen tablecloth. "Sign it, gold digger. You bring nothing to this family," she announced into the microphone. I did not cry. I picked up my pen, signed on the dotted line, and then opened my own folder. When I slid it back across the table, my father-in-law nearly collapsed in shock because I was about to take everything they owned. Before I tell you how I brought a fake dynasty to its knees, let me know where you are watching from in the comments, and hit subscribe if you love seeing arrogant people get exactly what they deserve. The Buckhead Country Club was suffocatingly elegant tonight. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the imported floral arrangements that cost more than my parents' annual mortgage back in Chicago. I sat at the head table wearing a simple silk dress, trying to look like I belonged in this world of old money. My fiancé, Marcus, sat beside me, sipping his expensive bourbon and laughing with his groomsmen. His family, the Sterlings, were considered absolute royalty here. They were a legacy family built on a logistics and real estate empire that demanded respect from everyone in the room. I was just Amara, a freelance financial consultant from the south side of Chicago. At least that was what they believed. Cecilia, my soon-to-be mother-in-law, stood up and tapped her crystal champagne flute with a heavy silver spoon. The gentle clinking sound immediately silenced the room. 80 wealthy guests turned their attention toward our table, expecting a touching toast about love and family legacy. Instead, Cecilia looked down at me with a perfectly manicured smirk. She reached into her designer tote bag and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. She dropped the 50-page prenuptial agreement right onto my dinner plate, splashing red wine reduction sauce onto the pristine white tablecloth. "Sign it, gold digger," Cecilia said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room without the need for a microphone. "I know your working-class parents back in Chicago did not teach you how generational wealth works, but we are not going to let a freelancer bleed the Sterling Empire dry." A collective gasp rippled through the guests. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, not from shame, but from the sheer audacity of her action. I looked at Marcus, expecting him to stand up, defend me, or at least snatch the insulting papers away from his mother. We had been together for 3 years. We had shared dreams and built a life together, but Marcus did not stand up. He did not look angry. He simply reached over and patted my hand with a sickeningly condescending smile. "Just sign it, babe," Marcus whispered loudly enough for the people nearby to hear. "You know it is just a formality to keep the peace. You bring nothing to the table financially anyway. It is better to just keep my mother happy so we can enjoy the rest of the evening." His words hit me harder than Cecilia's public humiliation. This was the man who claimed he loved my independent spirit. The man who said my humble background kept him grounded. Now he was sitting here publicly agreeing that I was a worthless charity case. The betrayal cut deep, but it also confirmed everything my private investigators had uncovered about the Sterling family over the past 6 months. Camille, my future sister-in-law, leaned across the table and laughed softly, her diamond earrings catching the light. "Did they not teach you how to read contracts at Spelman College, Amara? Or were you too busy trying to find a rich husband to secure your future?" She looked around this table, seeking validation from her wealthy peers. I looked at Cecilia with her haughty triumph. I looked at Reginald, my father-in-law, who was swirling his wine with a look of utter boredom. I looked at Marcus, who was already looking back at his groomsmen, as if discarding my dignity was just a minor inconvenience. I did not shed a single tear. I did not run out of the room like they expected me to. Instead, I calmly reached into my purse. I bypassed the tissues and pulled out my favorite Mont Blanc fountain pen. Without reading a single word of the insulting 50-page document, I flipped to the back and signed my name with a heavy flourish. "There," I said, sliding the prenuptial agreement back towards Cecilia. "Your precious assets are completely protected from me." Cecilia looked slightly taken aback by my lack of resistance, but her smug smile quickly returned. "Good girl," she said, picking up the document. "Now we can proceed with the wedding tomorrow without worrying about our bank accounts being drained by someone who does not understand the value of a dollar." I smiled back a genuine wide smile that made Marcus shift uncomfortably in his chair. "Actually," I said, my voice steady and loud enough to command the room, "since we are handling legal documents during dinner, I have something for you to review, as well." I reached back into my bag and pulled out a heavy folder, sealed with a bright red border. I bypassed Cecilia entirely and slid the folder straight down the long table, until it stopped perfectly in front of Reginald. The patriarch of the Sterling family looked down at the red-bordered folder with a mixture of confusion and annoyance. "What is the meaning of this?" Reginald demanded, adjusting his reading glasses and looking at me with pure disdain. "I have signed my side of the agreement to protect your assets from me. Now, Reginald, you need to sign this to protect your assets from the bank. That is a formal notice of default." The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Reginald ripped open the folder and began scanning the first page. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like he might faint right into his prime rib. His hands began to shake, making the papers rustle loudly in the quiet room. "My firm just acquired your $40 million toxic debt," I announced, enunciating every single syllable clearly. "You have defaulted on 3 consecutive loan payments to your previous creditors. I bought that debt for pennies on the dollar last week. You have exactly 12 hours to surrender 65% of Sterling Logistics to my firm, or I will personally file for Chapter 11 bankruptcy in federal court at 9 tomorrow morning." Reginald gasped and knocked over his wine glass, sending a dark red stain spreading across the table like blood. The illusion of the untouchable Sterling wealth was shattering in real time right in front of their elite friends. Suddenly, Bradley stepped forward. Bradley was Camille's husband, a white finance bro who served as the chief financial officer for the Sterling family business. He always wore perfectly tailored suits and carried an air of absolute superiority, especially when speaking to minority women. He burst into loud, mocking laughter, trying to break the tension that had suffocated the room. "Amara, you are completely delusional," Bradley said, stepping up behind Reginald and trying to read the documents over his shoulder. "You are a freelance consultant living in a rented apartment. Do you even know what Chapter 11 means? You do not have the capital to buy a used car, let alone our corporate debt." He looked around the room, encouraging the guests to join in his laughter. A few people chuckled nervously, but most were too captivated by Reginald's pale, terrified face to find anything funny. Bradley turned back to me, pointing a finger in my direction. "Stop playing games," Bradley sneered, leaning over the table aggressively. "You could not possibly afford to buy out a massive commercial loan. Who are you even claiming to represent?" I stood up, slowly smoothing down my silk dress. I reached into my clutch one last time and pulled out a solid black metal business card. I tossed it onto the table where it landed with a heavy metallic clink right next to the ruined prenuptial agreement. "Read it aloud." "Bradley," I challenged him, maintaining unwavering eye contact. Bradley snatched the card off the table. His mocking smile vanished the second his eyes scanned the engraved silver lettering. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight collar. "Amara Washington," he read, his voice suddenly lacking all its previous arrogance. "Chief Executive Officer, Obsidian Capital." "That is right," I said, leaning forward and resting my hands on the table. "I am not a freelancer. I own the private equity firm that buys out failing businesses just like yours, and tomorrow morning, I am going to own everything you have." I watched as the reality of my words slowly registered on the faces of the people who had spent the last 3 years treating me like a charity case. Cecilia dropped the prenuptial agreement as if it had suddenly caught fire. Her mouth hung open, her perfectly painted lips trembling as she tried to formulate a response. Marcus stared at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "But you drive a Honda?" he stammered, sounding like a confused child. "You buy your clothes on sale. You told me you were struggling to pay off your student loans." I smiled, letting the sweet taste of revenge wash over me. "I built my empire from nothing while you were busy draining your father's failing company to fund your country club lifestyle. And speaking of draining company funds," I turned my attention back to Bradley, who was still holding my metal business card like a live grenade. "Since we are being so honest tonight, Bradley, perhaps you would like to explain to your father-in-law exactly why Obsidian Capital was able to acquire this debt so easily." Bradley took a step back, shaking his head rapidly. "I do not know what you are talking about," he said, but the sweat forming on his forehead betrayed his panic. "You are lying. You are just a bitter woman trying to ruin our family dinner." I reached for my iPad, which had been sitting quietly next to my plate all evening. I unlocked the screen and pulled up a highly detailed financial schematic. I tapped the screen and sent the file directly to the large monitor behind the head table, originally set up to display our engagement photos. "I am talking about the $4.2 million that you embezzled over the last 18 months, Bradley," I said, projecting my voice so every guest could hear the damning truth. The screen lit up with bank transfer records showing funds moving from Sterling Logistics to a shell company in the Cayman Islands. I watched your father-in-law mortgage his legacy while you quietly siphoned the remaining cash to fund your secret lifestyle. You thought because you were the smart financial expert in the room, no one would check your work, but my forensic accountants checked everything. Camille shrieked, covering her mouth with her hands as she stared at the undeniable proof of her husband's crimes displayed for all of Atlanta high society to witness. Bradley looked desperately around the room, realizing there was no escape from the trap I had sprung. Every single elite guest was staring at the man who had just mansplained finance to a private equity chief executive officer. The sheer poetic justice of this moment tasted far better than the expensive champagne they had been drinking. I had finally won this ruthless game completely and entirely without breaking a single sweat. The silence in the dining room stretched out, becoming a heavy, suffocating weight that pressed down on the Sterling family. I watched as the elite members of Atlanta high society, the people who had looked down their noses at me all evening, began to murmur among themselves. Silk dresses rustled as wealthy women leaned close to their husbands, whispering about the scandalous financial ruin displayed on the large monitor. Camille stood frozen, her hands still covering her mouth while her eyes darted between the screen and her husband. The realization that her lavish lifestyle was funded by stolen money was finally sinking in. She grabbed Bradley by his expensive tailored jacket, pulling him backward. She demanded to know if it was true, her voice cracking with a mixture of rage and humiliation. Bradley did not look at his wife. He kept his eyes locked on me. The arrogant smirk that usually lived on his face was completely gone, replaced by the desperate, frantic look of a cornered animal. The polished Southern gentleman facade he maintained to fit in with this wealthy black family melted away instantly. He took a step toward me, his expensive leather shoes loud against the hardwood floor. He ignored the gasps from the guests and the furious demands from Reginald, who was still clutching his chest in shock. Bradley leaned over the table, invading my personal space. The smell of his strong, expensive cologne mixed with the sharp scent of his nervous sweat. He dropped his voice to a venomous whisper, ensuring that only Marcus and I could hear his next words. He told me I was making a massive mistake. He said I thought I was so smart playing the undercover billionaire, but I had no idea how the real game was played. He smiled a nasty, desperate smile that made my stomach turn. He leaned even closer until his face was just inches from mine. He told me he never routed that stolen money using his own name. He said he was a chief financial officer, and he knew how to cover his tracks perfectly. He explained that every single wire transfer to the Cayman Islands, every forged document, and every fake invoice was authorized using the digital signature of the company vice president. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air between us before delivering his final blow. He told me he used Marcus to authorize everything. Bradley stepped back, straightening his tie with trembling hands. He told me if I blew the whistle to the Securities and Exchange Commission, my precious fiancé would be the one going to a federal penitentiary for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. He said I would be sending the man I loved to prison while he walked away clean. The air in my lungs suddenly felt thin. I turned slowly to look at Marcus, expecting him to jump up and deny the accusation. I expected him to grab Bradley by the collar and defend his own innocence. Instead, Marcus was staring at the table, his face the color of chalk. His complete silence was a louder confession than any words could ever be. He had let his brother-in-law use him as a human shield. He was the vice president of a logistics empire, but he had always been too lazy and too entitled to actually read the financial reports he signed. He just wanted the prestigious title, the corner office, and the massive salary that funded his luxury car and his expensive golf trips. He had blindly signed away his own freedom because he was too incompetent to understand basic corporate finance. The murmurs in the room were growing louder as the guests realized the police might be called at any moment. People were already gathering their coats and heading for the exits, eager to distance themselves from a family that was about to be destroyed by federal investigators. Marcus finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging painfully into my skin. He pulled me away from the table, dragging me toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the dining room. I ignored his mother, who was currently screaming at the waitstaff to turn off the monitor. He dragged me down the carpeted hallway of the country club and pushed me into the private wine tasting room. The heavy wooden door clicked shut behind us, cutting off the noise of the ruined rehearsal dinner. The room was cold and smelled of damp earth and aged oak. Thousands of expensive wine bottles lined the mahogany racks from floor to ceiling. Marcus began to pace back and forth across the small room, running his hands over his head in a frantic panic. He did not apologize for his mother sliding a prenuptial agreement in my face. He did not apologize for sitting silently while his family humiliated me. Instead, he turned his panic into anger and aimed it entirely at me. He pointed an accusing finger at my face and told me I was a liar. He said I had deceived him for 3 years. He demanded to know why the chief executive officer of a massive private equity firm was living in a modest 2-bedroom apartment on the south side of Chicago. He yelled that I drove a beat-up 10-year-old car just to make him feel sorry for me. He accused me of playing a sick psychological game to test his love. He said I had manipulated his family and embarrassed them on purpose when I could have simply written a check to save their failing business. I stood there listening to his pathetic attempts to gaslight me. I felt a cold, absolute clarity wash over my mind. He was trying to make me the villain because he could not handle his own failures. I told him I never lied about my career. I told him I was a financial consultant, which was entirely true. I consulted on multi-million-dollar corporate liquidations. I lived modestly because I valued building generational wealth over buying flashy designer clothes to impress strangers. I reminded him that every time I tried to talk about my business, he would talk over me or change the subject to his own golf handicap. He never cared to ask about my life because he only cared about having an audience for his own ego. Marcus ignored my words completely. He stepped closer, his tone changing from angry to desperate. He grabbed both of my hands, holding them tightly against his chest. He dropped his voice to a pleading whisper. He told me he only signed those documents for Bradley because he trusted his family. He said he did it for us to ensure we had a wealthy future together. He begged me to cancel the notice of default. He told me my firm had enough capital to easily absorb a $40 million loss. He called it a small price to pay for our love. He said if I really loved him, I would let Obsidian Capital take the financial hit so his family could keep their company and their social status. He told me I had to wipe out the debt and delete the evidence of the embezzlement so he would not go to federal prison. He promised we could still get married tomorrow at the megachurch just like we planned. He said we could pretend none of this ever happened and live happily ever after. I looked at the man holding my hands, and I felt nothing but pure, visceral disgust. The love I thought I had for him evaporated completely, leaving an empty, hollow space in my chest. The pieces of the puzzle finally clicked together in my mind. He knew his family business was bankrupt long before he proposed to me. He knew the financial authorities were closing in. He did not ask me to marry him because he loved my independent spirit. He asked me to marry him because he thought I was a poor, uneducated girl who would be so desperately grateful for his wealth that she would never question his business dealings. He wanted a docile, clueless wife who would happily sign joint tax returns and take the fall when the federal investigators finally came knocking. He was setting me up to be the scapegoat for his entire family. I pulled my hands away from his grasp as if his touch burned my skin. I took a slow, deliberate step backward, putting physical distance between myself and his toxic manipulation. I looked him straight in the eyes and told him he was the most pathetic excuse for a man I had ever met. I told him I would rather burn my company to the ground than spend a single dollar to save a family of arrogant thieves. I told him my parents worked 50-hour weeks at a hospital and a shipping yard just to send me to a historically black college so I could learn how to dismantle corrupt corporations exactly like his. I watched the hope drain completely from his eyes. He realized his manipulation tactics were completely useless against me. I reached into my silk clutch and pulled out my mobile phone. I unlocked the screen and opened my keypad. Marcus watched my hands with wide, terrified eyes. He asked me what I was doing, his voice cracking with fear. He asked if I was calling my board of directors to cancel the debt collection. I did not answer him. I dialed a specific 10-digit number I knew by heart from my years of working in corporate financial liquidation. I raised the phone to my ear and waited for the automated system to connect me to an active agent. The room was so quiet I could hear Marcus breathing heavily. The line clicked, and a stern, professional voice answered the call asking how they could assist me. I kept my eyes locked directly on Marcus as I spoke into the receiver. I stated my name clearly and told the agent I needed to report a massive ongoing corporate embezzlement scheme. I said I had definitive proof of wire fraud, offshore shell companies in the Cayman Islands, and willful tax evasion totaling over $4 million. I stated the names of the individuals involved, identifying the chief financial officer and the vice president of Sterling Logistics. Marcus let out a strangled sob. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed onto the cold stone floor of the wine cellar. He fell to his knees directly in front of me, crying uncontrollably and begging me to hang up the phone. He reached out with trembling hands, trying to grab the hem of my dress, but I stepped out of his reach. I calmly gave the federal agent the exact address of the Buckhead Country Club and suggested they send an investigative team immediately because the suspects were currently gathered in the main dining hall trying to flee the premises. I listened as the agent confirmed the information and promised immediate action. I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my purse. I looked down at the man who had planned to ruin my life so he could maintain his fake wealthy facade. I told him to dry his tears because the federal authorities were on their way, and he needed to look presentable for his mugshot. The heavy oak door of the wine tasting room flew open before Marcus could even wipe the tears from his face. Cecilia stood in the doorway, breathing heavily, her chest heaving against her expensive silk gown. Her usually perfect hair was slightly out of place, and the polite society smile she wore like a mask was completely gone. She had realized the money was gone, and the federal agents were actually coming. She marched into the room, her high heels clicking sharply against the stone floor, and she glared at me with a level of hatred I had never seen before. She stepped over her own crying son, ignoring him completely to get to me. She told me I was nothing but a manipulative little street rat. She asked me if I honestly thought having a few $1,000,000 in a private equity firm made me their equal. She reminded me that in this city, money was only half the equation, and pedigree was everything else. She leaned in close, pointing her manicured finger at my face, and told me she was the chairwoman of the Atlanta Heritage Board. She proudly stated she had been the president of her prestigious sorority for 2 decades, and she controlled the guest list for every major charity gala from here to Washington, D.C. She laughed a bitter, cruel sound, and told me my background was a joke to people like her. She said she knew all about my parents, Calvin and Josephine. She mocked my father for being a blue-collar truck driver who spent his life hauling freight on the highways. She insulted my mother, calling her a glorified bedpan cleaner just because she worked as a registered nurse on the south side of Chicago. She said my parents were uneducated laborers who did not even know which fork to use at a formal dinner, and no amount of new money was ever going to wash the working-class dirt off my family name. She promised she would use every single connection she had to destroy my reputation. She vowed to make sure every black elite circle blackballed Obsidian Capital until I was a complete social pariah with no clients and no future. I listened to her frantic, desperate threats without blinking. I let her exhaust herself, throwing her imaginary social weight around the room. When she finally paused to catch her breath, I calmly picked up my iPad from the tasting table. I unlocked the screen and opened the master financial ledger for my firm's recent real estate acquisitions. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to yell to establish dominance. I looked at Cecilia and told her that her social circles and her fancy heritage boards were completely irrelevant to me because people like her only cared about where the next party was being hosted. I tapped the screen and turned the iPad toward her so she could see the glowing spreadsheet. I told her she was welcome to try and blackball me from high society, but she might want to find a new location for her prestigious gatherings. I explained that Obsidian Capital had quietly purchased the defaulted mortgage to this exact country club 3 weeks ago. I told her the ground she was currently standing on, the ballroom where her friends were currently gossiping, and the golf course outside were all legally my property. I watched her eyes widen as she read the legal ownership documents displayed on the screen. I suggested she lower her voice and treat me with some respect before I had my personal security team escort her off my property for trespassing. The color completely drained from Cecilia's face. The realization that I literally owned the building where she derived all her social power broke her entirely. Her shoulders slumped, and the fierce, arrogant matriarch of the Sterling family suddenly looked like a terrified old woman. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Before Cecilia could try to salvage her dignity, the heavy wooden opened again. Reginald walked into the wine room, shutting the door firmly behind him. He looked like he had aged 20 years in the last 10 minutes. His posture was hunched. His expensive tuxedo looked suddenly too big for him, and his eyes carried the heavy burden of a man who knew his empire had fallen. He looked down at Marcus, who was still weeping silently on the floor, and he shook his head in absolute disgust. He did not ask if his son was okay. He did not comfort his wife, who was leaning against the wine racks in shock. He looked directly at me and proved exactly why this family was so toxic. Reginald told me we needed to speak like rational business partners. He said Bradley was a fool, And Marcus was a disappointment, and he was willing to throw them both to the wolves to save the core of the company. He told me he knew that the federal authorities were coming for his son and his son-in-law, but the logistics company itself could still be salvaged if we worked together. He offered to hand over all the incriminating evidence I would ever need to put Bradley and Marcus behind bars, guaranteeing they would take the sole blame for the offshore accounts and the wire fraud. He was offering to sacrifice his own children just to keep his title as the head of the company. Reginald stepped closer, trying to put on a diplomatic smile that looked grotesque on his pale face. He offered me a permanent seat on the board of directors and full controlling interest of the entire Sterling enterprise. He said I could have everything I originally came for without a lengthy court battle, but he had one condition. He told me I still had to walk down the aisle and marry Marcus tomorrow afternoon. He said the media was already expecting the wedding of the year, and canceling it now would raise too many questions and destroy the company's stock price before we could stabilize it. He begged me to put on a white dress smile for the cameras and pretend to be a happy bride just to save face in the press. He promised that after a year we could arrange a quiet divorce, and I would walk away with the majority of his empire. I stared at Reginald, feeling a level of revulsion I had never experienced in all my years on Wall Street. I had dealt with ruthless corporate raiders and greedy executives, but seeing a father casually offer up his son to the federal government just to save a failing business was repulsive. I looked down at Marcus, who was staring up at his father with an expression of pure heartbreak. Marcus finally understood that he was nothing more than a pawn to his own family, just like I was supposed to be. I told Reginald he was a disgusting, pathetic man. I told him I did not need his permission or his backroom deals to take control of his company because I already owned his debt and I was going to liquidate his legacy piece by piece. I told him there would be no wedding tomorrow, no fake smiles for the cameras, and absolutely no mercy for anyone in this room. I turned my back on the three of them, leaving them trapped in the cold wine cellar with their ruined lives and their impending federal indictments. I opened the door and walked out into the main hallway. The country club was in total chaos. Guests were whispering frantically, pulling on their coats, and rushing toward the valet stand. The illusion of the perfect elite family had been shattered, and no one wanted to be around when the police arrived. I walked through the crowd with my head held high, ignoring the stares and the pointed whispers. I did not look back. I stepped out through the grand front doors into the warm, humid Atlanta night air. The valet immediately brought my chauffeured Maybach to the curb. My driver opened the door for me, and I slid into the luxurious leather back seat, letting out a long, deep breath. It felt like I had just waged a war and won. As the car pulled away from the country club heading toward my hotel, my entire body began to relax. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water from the console and watched the city lights blur past the tinted windows. I thought the worst was over. I thought I had completely dismantled the Sterling family and secured my victory. But then my mobile phone began to vibrate violently in my purse. It was not just one call. It was a relentless stream of notifications, text messages, and urgent alerts. I pulled the phone out and looked at the screen. My heart dropped into my stomach. The caller ID showed my lead crisis management director from Obsidian Capital. Before I could even answer, a news alert flashed across the top of my screen from a major financial news network. The headline read that Obsidian Capital was under investigation for being a massive Ponzi scheme. My stock portfolio was taking an absolute nosedive in after-hours trading. My firm's reputation was bleeding out in real time across every major media outlet and blog in the country. Bradley had not just threatened me in the dining room. When he realized I was actually calling the authorities, he had triggered a dead man's switch. He had leaked highly sophisticated falsified documents to the press claiming that my entire private equity firm was a fraud built on stolen investments. He knew he was going down for embezzlement, so he decided to drag my entire life's work down with him. The war was not over at all. It had just moved from the private rooms of a country club to the most public and unforgiving arena possible. The sun began to rise over the Atlanta skyline, casting a pale gray light into the penthouse suite of the Four Seasons Hotel. It was exactly 8:00 the morning on the day that was supposed to mark the beginning of my happily ever after. Instead of sitting in a plush silk chair sipping expensive mimosas while a celebrity pretty makeup artist applied my bridal glow, I was standing in the center of the room pacing back and forth across the thick carpet. The massive luxury suite had been completely transformed overnight. Room service carts holding cold, untouched coffee and stale pastries were shoved into the corners to make room for reality. The long mahogany dining table was buried under stacks of printed financial ledgers, legal briefs, and damage control strategies. My legal team had been arriving in shifts since 3:00 the morning, turning my bridal suite into a high-stakes corporate war room. The war room was buzzing with the sounds of rapid typing and hushed, frantic conversations. My lead defamation attorney was on the phone with publishers trying to trace the source of the leaked documents, but Bradley had used untraceable encrypted servers to distribute his lies. Bradley had executed his smear campaign with terrifying speed and precision. When he realized he was going down for embezzlement, he used his connections with the city's most expensive public relations fixers to feed a completely fabricated story to the media. He had leaked highly sophisticated fake documents to every major financial news outlet and elite black society blog on the East Coast. My lead crisis management director sat on the velvet sofa, reading the fresh headlines aloud, and each one felt like a physical blow to my chest. They were calling me a master manipulator and a highly sophisticated con artist. The narrative they were aggressively spinning claimed that Obsidian Capital was nothing but an elaborate shell game, a predatory Ponzi scheme built entirely on empty promises and stolen investments. The articles claimed that my firm targeted vulnerable minority-owned businesses, promised them growth, and then cannibalized their assets to pay off early investors. It was a complete fabrication, but it was written with enough financial jargon to sound legitimate to the untrained public. The elite social blogs took a different angle, focusing purely on character assassination. They posted pictures of me from college wearing inexpensive clothes, next to pictures of me now trying to paint a narrative of a desperate gold digger who finally found her mark. They interviewed anonymous sources who claimed I had always been manipulative and calculating. The blogs read faithfully by the very same people who had attended the rehearsal dinner last night were tearing me apart with gleeful cruelty. The articles painted the Sterling family as the innocent, unsuspecting victims of a desperate social climber. They wrote that I had used my engagement to Marcus as a Trojan horse to infiltrate their ranks and steal the wealth of a historic legacy family. I looked at the screens of the laptops spread across the table, watching the stock value of my company plummet in the pre-market trading hours. The professional reputation I had spent an entire decade building from absolute scratch was being dismantled piece by piece in the court of public opinion. They attacked my background mercilessly, bringing up my parents' working-class roots on the south side of Chicago. They used my family's modest history as definitive proof that I was just a greedy street rat, grasping desperately at generational wealth that did not belong to me. They completely erased my dual degrees, my years of grueling 8-0-hour work weeks, and my legitimate financial acumen. All the public saw was a false portrait of a poor girl trying to rob an established Southern dynasty. My public relations officer told me the damage was spreading faster than we could issue cease and desist orders because the elite community was eager to protect their own kind and eager to destroy an outsider like me. My mobile phone vibrated heavily against the glass surface of the table, drawing my attention away from the disastrous news broadcasts. I picked it up expecting another frantic pitch, but the screen displayed a text message from Marcus. The pure audacity of him reaching out to me after he had offered me up to take the fall for his crimes made my blood boil, but I opened the message anyway. He had carefully typed out an ultimatum that carried the heavy, arrogant stench of his father, Reginald. Marcus wrote that the press was going to absolutely destroy me and leave me with nothing but a worthless company and a ruined name by the end of the day. He said his family was willing to offer me one final act of grace. The text message from Marcus was long and meticulously crafted, likely dictated by Reginald himself. He framed his extortion as an act of profound love and forgiveness. He wrote that his mother was willing to overlook my outburst at the rehearsal dinner if I proved my loyalty to the Sterling name today. He told me the bridal suite was paid for, and the guests were already getting ready for the royal wedding of the season. He detailed the non-disclosure agreement specifying that I would never speak of the $40 million debt or Bradley's offshore accounts to anyone, including federal authorities. In return, I would get to live the comfortable life of a Sterling wife, attending charity galas and hosting garden parties, while my firm was quietly dissolved to protect their secrets. The sheer arrogance required to offer me a gilded cage, while actively trying to destroy my life, was breathtaking. He demanded that I put on my wedding dress and walk down the aisle of the megachurch at exactly 2:00 the afternoon, just like we originally planned. He laid out his terms, clearly stating that if I smiled for the cameras, signed a strict non-disclosure agreement, and formally dropped the $40 million debt collection, his father would call in favors with his powerful media contacts. He promised Reginald could make the entire smear campaign disappear by tomorrow morning, restoring my firm's reputation in exchange for my total surrender to their family. He wanted me to become a silent, obedient prisoner to the Sterling Empire just to save the company I built. Before I could even process the sheer manipulative evil of his offer, my phone rang again. This time, it was an urgent conference call from the board of directors at Obsidian Capital. I answered the call, putting it on speaker mode so my legal team could hear the conversation. The voices on the other end of the line were panicked, angry, and demanding immediate answers. The conference call with the board of directors felt like standing in front of a firing squad. These were men and women who had watched me grow this company from a tiny startup in a leased office space to a major player on Wall Street. But loyalty in the financial sector only extends as far as the latest profit margin. My primary investor, the people who had trusted me with their wealth when I first founded the firm, were completely losing their nerve. They told me the negative publicity was triggering a massive panic in the sector, and several key clients were threatening to pull their capital by the close of the business day. The chairman of the board, his voice tight with undeniable stress, informed me that they were preparing to call an emergency meeting. The chairman reminded me that our firm held fiduciary duties to pension funds and university endowments, and they could not risk being associated with a federal fraud investigation, even a fake one. They demanded a public statement refuting every claim, but also demanded that I step back from daily operations while an independent auditor reviewed our books. It was a standard crisis protocol, but it felt like a profound betrayal. They were asking me to surrender my sword while I was in the middle of a brutal battlefield. He told me point blank that if I could not stop this media bleeding within the next few hours, they would have no choice but to initiate a formal vote of no confidence. They were preparing to legally remove me as the chief executive officer of my own company in a desperate attempt to distance the firm from the scandal. They were going to strip me of my life's work because Bradley had successfully weaponized the media against me. The walls of the penthouse felt like they were rapidly closing in on me, suffocating my ability to think clearly. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking down at the sprawling city of Atlanta, bathed in the bright morning light. I had fought so incredibly hard to climb out of poverty to build an empire that could protect me and provide for my family. But now I was completely cornered by people who wielded their massive social influence like a weapon. The Sterling family was using the very society they controlled to crush me into submission. I stood there contemplating the unthinkable. The pressure was so immense that I wondered if I should just step down from my company entirely and resign my position just to save the firm from total collapse. I thought about letting Marcus and his toxic family win just to stop the relentless public humiliation and protect my investors. I was dangerously close to letting them break my spirit. The exhaustion of fighting a corrupt system designed to protect old money at all costs was weighing heavily on my shoulders. I took a deep breath, closing my eyes and preparing to turn around. I was ready to tell my legal team to begin drafting my official letter of resignation. But before I could speak a single word, the heavy mahogany doors of the penthouse suite did not just open, they crashed against the wall with a thunderous impact that silenced every single lawyer in the room. Papers scattered off the long dining table as the violent sound shattered the suffocating tension of the crisis meeting. It was not the hotel staff bringing fresh coffee, and it was certainly not the celebrity makeup artist arriving to apply my bridal glamour. I turned around to see my parents, Calvin and Josephine, marching into the suite with an energy that commanded absolute terrifying respect. Cecilia and Reginald had spent the last 3 years turning their noses up at my family, treating them like unfortunate charity cases. They had constantly mocked my father, Calvin, for driving a freight truck for 40 years, and they had sneered at my mother, Josephine, for wearing sensible shoes and working night shifts at a Southside hospital. The arrogant Sterling family honestly believed that because my parents did not summer in Martha's Vineyard or hold legacy memberships at an elite country club, they were somehow ignorant and weak. They could not have been more completely wrong. My father stood in the center of the luxurious room wearing a sharply tailored charcoal suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly. The heavy calluses on his hands were earned through decades of grueling manual labor building, the very same supply chains that greedy executives like Reginald constantly exploited for profit. He did not look intimidated by the expensive corporate lawyers or the sprawling hotel suite. My mother stood right beside him, her posture impossibly straight, radiating a quiet, dangerous power. She held a massive leather briefcase in her arms, clutching it with the fierce protective grip of a mother who had come to save her child. They were not the uneducated laborers the Sterlings loved to gossip about. They were brilliant strategic survivors who had navigated the most unforgiving neighborhoods in Chicago and emerged completely unbroken. Flanking my parents was Elias, a man known throughout the Eastern Seaboard as the most ruthless corporate litigator in the entire financial sector. Elias was a ghost in the financial district, a man who only appeared when a major Fortune 500 company was about to be violently dismantled. He adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and surveyed the panicked legal team spread across my suite with absolute disdain. Elias did not waste time with the pleasantries or formal introductions. He walked straight to the dining table, pushing aside the stacks of useless damage control strategies my crisis managers had frantically drafted. He cleared a large empty space in the center of the table and turned to my father, giving him a single respectful nod. Calvin stepped forward and placed his heavy hands on the table, looking around at the expensive lawyers who had just been advising me to surrender my entire life's work to the Sterling family. My father let out a low rumbling laugh that carried no humor whatsoever. He asked the room if those country club elites honestly thought a retired union truck driver did not understand how organized labor and corporate leverage actually work. He reached over and unclasped my mother's leather briefcase, pulling out a massive stack of thick legal documents bound tightly in heavy rubber bands. He dropped them directly onto the cleared space on the table, and the heavy thud of the paperwork hitting the wood echoed through the silent suite. My father looked at me with a fierce, protective pride shining in his eyes and explained exactly what he and my mother had been doing while the media was busy tearing my reputation apart over the last 48 hours. Over the years, as my private equity firm became wildly successful, I had quietly gifted my parents millions of dollars, wanting them to retire in luxury and buy a mansion in a wealthy suburb. But my parents never touched a single cent of that money for themselves. They had kept it secured in a high-yield account, living their same modest life on the South Side just in case I ever needed a safety net. And when they saw the Sterling family threatening to destroy me, they weaponized every single dollar of that hidden wealth. Calvin explained that Sterling Logistics was not just owned by Reginald and his arrogant board members. A massive portion of the company was distributed among minority shareholders and thousands of blue-collar union workers whose pensions were tied directly to the company stock. My father had spent his entire career in the trucking industry, so he knew the union bosses, the shift supervisors, and the warehouse managers who kept the Sterling empire running while Reginald played golf. Calvin explained that the Sterlings had spent decades treating their warehouse workers like disposable machinery, slashing benefits, denying overtime pay, and threatening to close facilities anytime the workers demanded basic human respect. For the past 2 days, Calvin and Josephine had been working the phones, calling in favors, and organizing emergency meetings with the union leaders who absolutely despised how Reginald and Bradley mismanaged their livelihoods. When my father walked into those union halls and sat down with the local chapter presidents, he did not bring corporate jargon or empty promises. He brought total financial transparency, showing them the actual accounting books that proved Reginald was bleeding their pension funds dry to pay for his country club memberships and his wife's extravagant charity galas. My father gave the workers a simple choice. They could let the Sterlings drive the company off a cliff and wipe out their retirement, or they could sign their voting rights over to the brilliant financial mind from the south side of Chicago who actually knew how to save their livelihoods. The workers did not hesitate for a single second, signing over every single proxy and giving my family the absolute power to tear the Sterling executives out of their corner offices. Using the millions of dollars I had given them, my parents systematically bought out the voting rights and secured the proxies of every single disgruntled worker and marginalized shareholder in the entire Sterling supply chain. Elias stepped forward to clarify the devastating financial reality of what my parents had just accomplished. The litigator picked up the top stack of documents and looked directly at my panicked board of directors who were still listening silently on the open conference call. Elias announced that as of this very minute, Amara Washington formally possessed exactly 51% of the proxy voting rights for Sterling Logistics. He let that massive revelation sink into the room, explaining that the hostile takeover was no longer a threat or a pending collection. It was an absolute reality. I did not just hold their toxic debt anymore. I legally controlled the entire corporate entity from the inside out, and I had the absolute voting majority to bypass Reginald completely. I could dissolve the current board of executives and liquidate the company assets without needing a single signature from the Sterling family. When Elias leaned over the speakerphone and delivered the fatal blow to my cowardly board of directors, The absolute silence on the line was intoxicating. These were powerful, wealthy investors who had just threatened to throw me to the wolves the moment the media smear campaign hit the internet. They thought they could push me out of my own firm to save their own reputations, but Elias dismantled their entire strategy with one simple sentence. He informed them that Amara Washington was no longer just the chief executive officer of Obsidian Capital, but she was now the undisputed controlling owner of the largest logistics empire in the southeastern United States. He told the board that if they moved forward with their pathetic vote of no confidence, they would be declaring war on the single most powerful stakeholder in the room, and I would make it my personal mission to liquidate their shares and bankrupt their individual portfolios before the market opened on Monday. The board members tripped over their own words, frantically apologizing and swearing their total loyalty to me. I reached out and pressed the end call button, terminating their pathetic apologies mid-sentence. The suffocating weight that had been crushing my chest all morning suddenly vanished, replaced by a surging tidal wave of adrenaline and pure vindication. I looked at my mother and father, feeling tears burning the edges of my eyes. They had not come to console me or tell me to turn the other cheek. They had come to hand me the ultimate weapon to destroy the people who were trying to break me. Josephine walked around the table and pulled me into a tight, fierce embrace. My mother smelled of lavender and vanilla, a comforting, familiar scent that grounded me instantly. She whispered in my ear, telling me that our family did not back down from arrogant bullies, and we certainly did not surrender our hard-earned empires to thieves in expensive suits. She looked at my expensive engagement ring sitting abandoned next to the financial ledgers and picked it up, inspecting the massive diamond with a look of pure contempt. Josephine told me she always knew Marcus was a weak, fragile boy wearing a man's expensive suit. She said real men do not hide behind their mothers, and they certainly do not use the women they love as human shields to protect their own cowardice. She dropped the diamond ring back onto the table like it was a piece of cheap plastic. She told me the Sterlings thought they could intimidate me because I grew up in a modest brick house instead of a gated mansion, but they forgot that pressure only creates diamonds and fire only refines steel. She instructed me to stop looking at the news articles and start looking at the weapons I now held in my hands, telling me to wipe my eyes, stand up straight, and finish the war I started. The pure, unconditional love and absolute strategic brilliance of my parents gave me back every ounce of strength the media smear campaign had drained from me. I was no longer a cornered animal. I was the undisputed majority shareholder, and I was ready to burn the Sterling legacy to the ground. The room began to buzz with a new, frantic energy as my legal team shifted from damage control to aggressive offensive strategies. The lawyers were rapidly scanning the signed proxy forms, verifying the union signatures, and preparing to force an emergency injunction through the federal courts. The plan was to walk into the wedding ceremony, not as a bride, but as a conquering monarch ready to formally terminate the entire Sterling family in front of their 500 elite guests. I was mentally preparing the exact speech I would deliver from the altar when Elias suddenly stopped dead in his track. The brilliant litigator was staring intently at his secure, encrypted tablet. His jaw clenched so tightly I could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. The digital security team from my firm had been monitoring the Sterling corporate accounts ever since I purchased their initial toxic debt, placing quiet, invisible tracking algorithms inside the company banking portals to ensure Reginald did not try to hide assets before my collection notice expired. Elias turned his screen toward me, and the bright red warning notifications flashing across the dashboard made my stomach drop. Bradley, the arrogant white finance bro who thought he was invincible, had just realized his embezzlement scheme was going to be exposed. Bradley knew he could not blame the missing $2 million on Marcus anymore because federal investigators would look at the digital footprints and easily trace the funds back to his own devices. The cowardly chief financial officer was executing a scorched earth protocol. Elias traced his finger along the frantic data streams pouring across the screen, explaining that Bradley was currently initiating a massive unregulated backdoor wire transfer. Bradley was not just emptying the corporate operational accounts to save himself. He was actively hacking into the company employee pension funds. He was stealing the exact same retirement money that belonged to the union workers my father had just convinced to support me. Bradley was attempting to funnel tens of millions of dollars through a highly complicated maze of international cryptocurrency tumblers and offshore shell corporations. His ultimate goal was a completely anonymous numbered account sitting in a private bank in Zurich, Switzerland. Elias explained that Bradley planned to secure the stolen funds, grab his passport, and disappear on a private jet before the wedding guests even took their seats at the church. The lawyer looked at the intricate clearinghouse timers ticking down on the right side of his screen. The massive transfer was temporarily suspended in an automated security hold due to the massive volume of the transaction and the strict international banking regulations that govern weekend wire routing. Elias looked at me, his eyes dark and deadly serious, telling me the automated security hold was the only thing keeping the union workers from losing their entire life savings. He pointed to the countdown clock showing exactly 90 minutes remaining before the final international gateway cleared the transaction entirely. Elias told me we had exactly 1 hour and 30 minutes to execute a total hostile digital takeover of the sterling banking system, lock the rogue chief financial officer out of his own accounts, and freeze every single asset they owned. If that clock hit 0 before we stopped him, Bradley would vanish with the money, the logistics company would collapse into catastrophic bankruptcy, and thousands of innocent families would be completely destroyed. The countdown clock on Elias's screen was bleeding away the seconds with ruthless precision. 90 minutes was barely enough time to order room service in a luxury hotel, let alone stop a highly sophisticated international wire transfer executed by a rogue chief financial officer. I did not panic. Panic was a luxury reserved for the weak, and I had just become the absolute majority shareholder of a logistics empire. I kicked off my designer heels, tossing them carelessly onto the plush carpet, and rushed toward the long dining table. I shoved aside the ring boxes and the discarded prenuptial agreement. Clearing a massive workspace, I grabbed my 3 high-performance laptops from my secure travel case and flipped them open side by side, arranging them into a digital command center right in the middle of the bridal suite. My mother Josephine stood back, giving me the physical space I needed, while my father Calvin watched the glowing screens with intense silent focus. Elias plugged his encrypted tablet directly into my central laptop, bridging his legal access codes with my digital infrastructure. I did not have time to put on a wedding dress or care about the media smear campaign currently raging outside my hotel window. My only focus was the digital warpath Bradley had just initiated. I opened a secure encrypted communication channel to my chief technology officer at Obsidian Capital, pulling my entire cybersecurity strike team into a live audio feed. The moment my team came online, the bridal suite filled with the rapid-fire sounds of aggressive keystrokes and high-stakes financial targeting. I ordered my lead security architect to mirror the Sterling Logistics banking portal because my father had successfully secured the 51% proxy voting rights. I was no longer an outside corporate raider trying to hack a firewall. I was legally the undisputed controlling owner of the company. Elias reined union proxy forms into the Federal Corporate Registry database, forcing a massive hard reset on the Sterling corporate hierarchy. The moment the system recognized my digital signature as the new controlling entity, it granted me absolute administrative access to the entire financial architecture of the logistics empire. I bypassed the standard security gateways that Reginald and Bradley had established years ago, tearing down their digital walls with absolute authority. My screens lit up with thousands of active data nodes, showing the exact flow of corporate capital. The financial bleeding was catastrophic. Bradley was not just trying to steal a few $1 million to fund his escape to Switzerland. He was actively executing a scorched earth strategy, trying to completely hollow out the company from the inside. He had bypassed the operational accounts and was plunging his digital claws directly into the employee pension funds. These were the life savings of the very same warehouse workers and truck drivers who had just trusted my father with their proxy votes. Bradley was trying to steal their retirements to pay for his luxury lifestyle in exile. I watched the data streams routing through the international clearinghouses. Bradley was smart, but he was operating out of pure, blind desperation. He knew he could not just wire tens of millions of dollars straight to a private Swiss bank account without triggering international money laundering protocols. Instead, he was attempting to route the stolen pension funds through a highly complex labyrinth of cryptocurrency tumblers. He was breaking the massive fortune down into thousands of tiny, untraceable microtransactions, trying to wash the money through unregulated digital exchanges before reassembling the funds in Zurich. The countdown clock hit 60 minutes. My cybersecurity team was working frantically alongside me, tracing the individual data packets across the blockchain ledgers. The cyber war was brutal and adrenaline pumping every time I managed to freeze a domestic routing number. Bradley would instantly counter by opening 3 new proxy accounts in unregulated territories. He was fighting like a cornered rat, frantically clicking through his own administrative portals, unaware that I was watching his every single move from my bridal suite. The heat from the 3 laptops was warming my face as my fingers flew across the keyboards. I could feel the heavy silence in the room as my parents and Elias watched the digital battlefield unfold. My father, Calvin, placed a heavy, calloused hand on my shoulder, offering a silent anchor of support. I thought about the thousands of blue-collar families who relied on those pension funds. I thought about the workers who broke their backs in the shipping yards, creating the wealth that the Sterling family treated like their own personal piggy bank. I was not going to let a cowardly white finance bro steal their futures. I initiated a massive counteroffensive. Instead of trying to catch the thousands of microtransactions floating through the cryptocurrency tumblers, I ordered my team to attack the root source. Using my newfound absolute majority power, I began systematically revoking Bradley's security clearances in real time. I locked him out of the primary human resources database, cutting off his access to the employee identification ledgers he was using to mask the transfers. Bradley realized what was happening immediately. I could see his digital footprint violently shifting tactics as he panicked. He abandoned the complicated tumbling process and attempted to force a single massive bulk wire transfer, pushing all the remaining pension capital toward a final offshore gateway. The countdown clock hit 30 minutes. The tension in the penthouse was thick enough to choke on. My lead security architect warned me over the audio feed that Bradley had initiated a direct override command using Reginald's stolen security credentials. The massive wire transfer was accelerating, pushing past the domestic firewalls and heading straight for the international banking gateway. If the funds crossed that digital border, they would be swallowed by Swiss banking secrecy laws, and I would never be able to recover the money for the union workers. I stared at the central monitor, watching the progress bar of the wire transfer moving with agonizing speed. 70%, 80%, 85%. My fingers cramped as I typed relentlessly, trying to build a digital blockade ahead of the transaction. Bradley was throwing every piece of malicious code he had at my firewalls, desperately trying to break through my administrative holds. The progress bar hit 90%. The room was completely silent except for the frantic clicking of my keyboard. Elias stood frozen, gripping his tablet while my mother held her breath. I needed a master override switch that could bypass the standard banking protocols and shut down the entire network simultaneously. The progress bar hit 95%. The money was slipping through my fingers. I quickly pivoted away from the banking portals and dove directly into the Federal Reserve routing interface because I held the absolute majority shareholder proxy. I had the legal right to declare a catastrophic corporate emergency. I drafted a rapid-fire digital injunction invoking a high-level federal freeze on all Sterling Logistics assets due to active internal fraud. I did not have time to wait for a judge to review the injunction. I had to force the banking system to recognize my authority immediately. I linked the federal injunction directly to the proxy documents my father had gathered, creating an undeniable chain of legal ownership. The progress bar hit 98%. The international gateway was opening. I could almost see Bradley's arrogant, smirking face waiting on the other side of the screen, ready to steal the livelihoods of thousands of hardworking families. I took a deep breath, isolated the primary outgoing server node, and slammed my finger down on the enter key, executing the master override command. The progress bar hit 99%, and then it completely froze. The glowing numbers on the screen stopped moving. The entire network architecture of the Sterling Logistics empire went completely dark. I had slammed the heavy iron doors of the domestic banking system shut, locking the massive fortune safely inside the corporate accounts. The federal emergency freeze rippled through the system, instantly rejecting Bradley's bulk wire transfer and bouncing the funds back into the protected employee pension ledgers. The interception was absolute and flawless. Bradley's digital access tokens were permanently revoked. He was completely locked out of the very same company he had spent years robbing blind. His screen was undoubtedly flashing with fatal error messages and federal warning banners. He had failed. The stolen money was secure, and the union workers' retirements were safely preserved under the ironclad protection of Obsidian Capital. A massive wave of relief crashed over the bridal suite. My cybersecurity team cheered loudly over the audio feed, celebrating the impossible interception. Elias let out a long breath, wiping sweat from his forehead, while my mother Josephine pressed her hands to her face in sheer joy. My father Calvin pulled me out of my chair and wrapped me in a massive bear hug, his strong arms lifting me off the ground. He told me he had never been more proud of anyone in his entire life. He said, I had just saved the future of his brothers and sisters in the shipping yards, and he knew I was always destined to be a true protector of our community. I hugged him back, burying my face in his shoulder, feeling the immense weight of the corporate battle finally lifting off my spirit. We had won the media smear campaign. Outside did not matter anymore because I held the absolute keys to the kingdom. I had completely dismantled the financial power of the Sterling family and protected the innocent people they tried to destroy. The celebration in this penthouse suite was euphoric, but it was tragically short-lived. The victory was suddenly shattered by the sharp, piercing ring of my mobile phone sitting on the edge of the dining table. The loud ringing sliced through the joyful atmosphere, pulling all of us back to the reality of the vicious enemies we were still fighting. I stepped away from my father's embrace and picked up the device the caller ID displayed, Reginald's private number. The patriarch of the Sterling family had obviously just realized his accounts were entirely frozen and his brilliant son-in-law had failed to escape with the stolen money. Reginald was cornered. His legacy was collapsing, and he had absolutely nothing left to lose. I answered the phone, putting it on speaker mode so my parents and Elias could hear the dying gasps of a ruined man. I expected Reginald to scream, to hurl insults, or to beg for mercy like his pathetic son Marcus had done in the wine cellar. But the voice that came through the speaker was terrifyingly calm and laced with a cold, calculated cruelty. Reginald did not ask about the frozen accounts or the failed wire transfer. He simply told me that I had played a very impressive game of financial chess, but I had forgotten to check my blind spots. Reginald explained that years ago, before Obsidian Capital was even a concept, he had been expanding his real estate portfolio through aggressive, predatory lending. He told me he specialized in buying up secondary debt from small community institutions, specifically targeting properties located in the lower-income neighborhoods of Chicago. My blood ran completely cold as I listened to his calm, aristocratic voice echoing through the suite. Reginald revealed his absolute dirtiest card, holding it over my head like a guillotine. He told me that his holding company legally owned the defaulted mortgage to my parents' community church on the south side of Chicago. It was the exact same historic church where my parents were married, where I was baptized, and where my father served as a senior deacon for 3 decades. It was the heart and soul of our entire community, a sacred place that anchored thousands of working-class families. Reginald told me that because the church had missed a minor balloon payment 2 years ago, he had the legal right to execute an immediate aggressive foreclosure. He did not care about the 51% proxy votes I just secured because the church mortgage was held under a completely separate private entity that he still controlled. Reginald delivered his final devastating ultimatum. He told me the media smear campaign had severely damaged his family name, and the only way to save their public image was to proceed with the royal wedding of the season as if nothing was wrong. He told me that if I did not put on my white dress, step out of my hotel room, and show up at the altar in exactly 1 hour to marry his son, he would order his demolition crews to completely bulldoze my parents' community church by Monday morning. He promised to turn the sacred building into a pile of rubble and concrete, destroying the spiritual home of my family, just to punish me for daring to challenge his power. The line went completely dead, leaving the dial tone ringing loudly in the silent luxury suite. The war was far from over. Reginald had just forced me to choose between saving my own freedom or saving the heart of my family. I slowly lowered the mobile phone from my ear and stared at the dark screen, my chest tightening with a new kind of rage. The patriarch of the Sterling family honestly thought he had played the ultimate trump card. He believed that holding the defaulted mortgage to the Southside Community Church would force me into a desperate corner. I looked up from my phone and met the eyes of my parents. I did not try to soften the blow. I told them exactly what Reginald had just threatened to do. I explained that if I did not put on my wedding dress and walk down the aisle in exactly 1 hour to save their public image, he would send demolition crews to bulldoze the sacred building where they were married and where my father had served as a senior deacon for 30 years. I expected my mother, Josephine, to gasp in horror, or my father, Calvin, to lose his temper and demand retaliation. Instead, my father let out a slow, deep chuckle that echoed through the tense atmosphere of the penthouse suite. He shook his head, looking at me with a calm, knowing expression. My father told me that Reginald was a desperate, arrogant fool who fundamentally did not understand how real community worked. My father explained that the church was not just a piece of real estate made of brick and stained glass. It was a massive congregation of resilient, unyielding people who had survived decades of redlining and systemic poverty on the south side of Chicago, he said. If Reginald even tried to send a single bulldozer to that property line, he would find 500 union workers standing arm in arm around the building before the engines even started. My mother stepped forward and placed her hands firmly on my shoulders. Looking deep into my eyes, she told me that our family did not negotiate with financial terrorists. She said, Reginald was trying to use our faith and our history as a weapon because his own legacy was currently collapsing around him. My parents' fierce, absolute lack of fear triggered a massive shift in my own mindset. I realized in that exact moment that simply bankrupting the Sterling family from the comfort of a hotel boardroom was not going to be enough. Crushing them digitally and seizing their corporate assets would strip them of their wealth, but it would leave their toxic social standing completely intact. The Sterlings valued their elite status in Atlanta high society far more than they valued their own bank accounts. If I wanted to truly destroy the monsters who had tried to steal the pensions of innocent workers and blackmail my family, I had to dismantle them publicly. I had to burn their fake dynasty to the ground in the exact same society they used to oppress everyone else. I turned to my executive assistant, who was standing quietly near the door, and told her to let the styling team inside the heavy wooden doors opened, and a team of frantic hair and makeup artists rushed into the war room pushing a massive metal garment rack. They had been waiting in terrified silence in the adjoining room all morning, listening to the corporate chaos unfold. I told them to bring the dress forward. This was no longer a standard wedding preparation. It was a highly calculated mobilization for war. The stylist unzipped the opaque garment bag, revealing a $25,000 custom Vera Wang gown. When I originally picked out the dress months ago, I thought it was a symbol of love and commitment. I thought it was the dress I would wear to start a beautiful new life now. As I looked at the heavy imported silk and the intricate hand-sewn French lace cascading down the skirt, I realized it was not a wedding dress at all. It was a custom-tailored suit of battle armor. I stripped off my silk robe and let the styling team lace me into the gown. The heavy corset pulled tight against my ribs, forcing my posture perfectly straight. The layers of tulle and silk settled around me, creating a silhouette of absolute, undeniable power. My mother walked up behind me in the floor-to-ceiling mirror and gently fastened a delicate diamond necklace around my throat. She smoothed the long, sheer veil over my shoulders and met my eyes in the reflection. She told me to walk into that megachurch with my head held high and make them regret the day they ever tried to intimidate a black woman from the South Side. Elias, my ruthless corporate litigator, stepped forward packing his encrypted tablet and the massive stack of union proxy forms into his leather briefcase. I told him to transfer every single piece of financial evidence we had gathered onto a single secure flash drive. I wanted the bank statements proving Bradley's offshore embezzlement, the forged signatures from Marcus, and the insulting prenuptial agreement all loaded onto one device. We left the penthouse suite and took the private elevator down to the underground parking garage where my security team and a fleet of black sport utility vehicles were waiting. The drive through the streets of Buckhead was a surreal experience. I looked out the tinted windows at the sprawling mansions and the perfectly manicured lawns of the Atlanta elite. These were people who built their entire identities on exclusion and generational wealth. They spent their weekends at charity galas judging anyone who did not share their pristine pedigree while completely ignoring the massive financial rot decaying beneath their own foundations. Today, they were all going to witness the collapse of one of their most prestigious families. We pulled up to the historic megachurch right in the heart of the city. The scene outside the massive stone building was absolute chaos. Cecilia had made sure to invite every major socialite, local politician, and prominent business leader to showcase her family's ultimate triumph. The paparazzi were swarming the grand stone steps, flashing their cameras relentlessly at the endless line of luxury vehicles pulling up to the valet. Elite bloggers and local news reporters who had been running the vicious smear campaign against my private equity firm all morning were standing behind velvet ropes. P.S. They were eager to catch a glimpse of the desperate gold digger who had finally been forced into submission. They thought I was showing up to surrender. I sat in the back of my vehicle watching the spectacle unfold through the dark glass. Elias handed me the silver flash drive and told me the cybersecurity team was on standby, ready to execute the final phase of our counterattack the moment I gave the signal. I took a deep breath, gripping the cold metal flash drive tightly in the palm of my hand. The driver opened my door and I stepped out of the vehicle. The blinding flashes of the paparazzi cameras illuminated the afternoon air. People were shouting my name, asking aggressive questions about the fraud allegations and the plunging stock price of my company. I did not answer them. I did not cover my face or shy away from the lenses. I kept my expression completely neutral and walked up the massive stone steps with the grace and absolute authority of an executioner arriving at the gallows. The heavy wooden doors of the church stood open, waiting to swallow me whole. Inside the massive sanctuary, 500 guests from the highest tiers of Black society were packed tightly into the wooden pews. The air was thick with the smell of expensive floral arrangements and the toxic buzzing of relentless gossip. Every single person in that room had read the morning blogs. They all believed the fabricated narrative that I was a master manipulator trying to steal a legacy fortune. They were whispering behind their embossed wedding programs, pointing and judging eagerly, waiting to watch the powerful Sterling family put me in my place. Sitting in the very front pew was Cecilia. She wore an aggressively flashy emerald green gown that looked more appropriate for a red carpet premiere than a mother of the groom dress. She was holding court, leaning over to whisper smugly to her sorority sisters, completely confident that her husband's blackmail had successfully broken my spirit. Across the aisle sat Reginald, standing tall and periodically adjusting his expensive tuxedo jacket. He looked incredibly pleased with himself, honestly believing that his threat against my parents' community church had secured his stolen empire forever. Bradley, the cowardly white chief financial officer who had tried to flee to Switzerland just 2 hours ago, was sweating profusely in his tailored suit. His face was flushed, and his hands were shaking as he repeatedly checked his mobile phone, desperately trying to understand why the corporate banking portals were still completely frozen and unyielding. But the most repulsive sight of all was Marcus. My former fiancé stood at the altar, looking down the long center aisle with a sickeningly triumphant smile on his handsome face. He actually believed he had won. He thought he had successfully forced me into becoming his silent, obedient shield, ready to take the fall for his financial crimes. The massive pipe organ began to play the heavy traditional chords of the bridal chorus. The inner doors at the back of the sanctuary slowly pulled open, revealing me to the entire congregation. A collective gasp echoed through the cavernous church, followed immediately by a deafening heavy silence. 500 pairs of judgmental eyes locked onto my custom Vera Wang gown. I stepped forward, beginning my slow, deliberate march down the center aisle. I did not look at the ground. I kept my chin raised, holding the direct gaze of every single person who had spent the morning reading lies about my character. I did not carry a bouquet of flowers. My hands were empty, except for the small silver flash drive clutched tightly in my right palm. As I walked closer to the altar, I watched the smug expression on Cecilia's face grow even wider. She leaned back in her pew, crossing her arms in absolute victory, thinking she had successfully tamed the wild, aggressive woman from Chicago. Reginald gave me a short, condescending nod as I passed his row, acknowledging my forced surrender to his corporate blackmail. Marcus stepped forward as I reached the end of the long, carpeted aisle. He extended his hand toward me, his smile radiating pure, toxic arrogance. He expected me to take his hand, lower my eyes, and stand quietly by his side while the pastor blessed a marriage built entirely on financial extortion and federal fraud. But I did not reach out to take his hand. I did not even pause to acknowledge his existence. I walked right past Marcus, leaving his hand hanging empty and useless in the air. The triumphant smile instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a look of sheer panicked confusion. A wave of shocked whispers rolled rapidly through the front pews as Cecilia suddenly sat up straight, gripping the wooden edge of her seat so hard her knuckles turned white. I completely bypassed the groom, ignoring the traditional positions at the altar. I walked straight up the carpeted stairs, ascending directly to the elevated marble pulpit. The elderly pastor looked at me in absolute bewilderment as I stepped into his sacred space. I did not wait for him to speak. I reached out and took the microphone directly from his trembling hands. The heavy silence in the sanctuary felt like a physical weight pressing down on the 500 elite guests who were staring up at me. I stood at the marble pulpit holding the microphone tightly in my hand. The elderly pastor took a nervous step backward, his eyes wide with confusion as I completely took over his sacred space. I looked down at Marcus, who was still standing at the altar, looking completely lost and humiliated. His hands were shaking as he realized I was not going to play the role of the silent, obedient bride. The entire congregation of Atlanta high society held their collective breath, waiting for me to break down or apologize for causing a scene, but I did not offer any apologies. I signaled to the audiovisual technicians sitting in the sound booth at the back of the balcony. I had already paid them triple their normal rate to ignore any commands from the Sterling family today. I took the silver flash drive from my palm and plugged it directly into the podium's digital interface port. A soft chime echoed through the massive church speakers, indicating the drive was connected. The two enormous projection screens mounted high above the altar flickered to life. The guests eagerly leaned forward, expecting to see the heavily edited romantic photo montage that Cecilia had commissioned to showcase our supposedly perfect relationship. They expected to see pictures of Marcus and me smiling on sandy beaches and posing at expensive charity galas. Instead, the screens lit up with the stark, glaring image of a 50-page legal document. The harsh white background of the prenuptial agreement illuminated the dark sanctuary, casting a harsh light over the front pews. I brought the microphone to my lips, and my voice echoed powerfully through the massive cathedral. I welcomed the esteemed guests to what was supposed to be the joining of two powerful families. I told them that last night at the rehearsal dinner, Cecilia Sterling had publicly humiliated me by sliding this exact document across the table. I pointed up at the massive screens where my cybersecurity team had highlighted specific clauses in bright yellow ink. I read the highlighted text aloud, letting the cruel words wash over the congregation. I explained that the Sterlings had legally defined me as a zero-asset addition to their family, claiming I brought absolutely no financial or social value to their historic legacy. A wave of shocked whispers immediately broke out among the wealthy guests in the pews. People were staring at Cecilia, who was suddenly trying to shrink down into her emerald green dress. Her face turned a deep shade of crimson as the elite women she had spent decades trying to impress realized how venomous she truly was. I did not let the crowd recover from the shock. I pressed the remote clicker, advancing to the next slide. The screen transitioned from the prenuptial agreement to a highly detailed financial summary displaying the official foreclosure notices for Sterling Logistics and the personal bankruptcy warning sent to Reginald. I looked directly at my father-in-law, who was gripping the edge of his wooden pew so tightly his hands were shaking. I announced to the gasping crowd that the untouchable Sterling empire was an absolute illusion. I told the congregation that Reginald had defaulted on $40 million in corporate debt and had been secretly leveraging their community investments to fund his country club lifestyle. I explained that he did not just fail at business. He actively betrayed the very same people sitting in this church by mismanaging their charitable donations and exploiting their trust. The guests began to murmur, angrily shifting in their seats as the reality of the Sterlings' financial ruin was laid bare for everyone to see. Reginald tried to stand up, his face pale and sweating, but his legs failed him and he slumped back down into his seat. I pressed the button again, bringing up the most devastating piece of evidence. Yet the massive screens shifted to display the internal banking ledgers of the logistics company. The bright red numbers highlighted a clear, undeniable trail of $4.2 million being siphoned directly out of the employee pension funds. I explained exactly how Bradley, the arrogant chief financial officer, had systematically robbed the blue-collar union workers who broke their backs to keep the company running. I showed the offshore shell accounts in the Cayman Islands and the cryptocurrency tumblers he used to wash the stolen capital. Bradley was sweating profusely, his expensive suit clinging to his body as he looked around the room, frantically looking for an exit. The guests were completely outraged, but I was not finished. I advanced the slide showing the digital authorization logs for every single fraudulent transfer. The screens displayed the unmistakable digital signature of Marcus Sterling approving the theft of millions of dollars from his own employees. I looked down at my former fiancé, who was now openly weeping at the altar. I told the congregation that Marcus was so desperate to maintain his fake wealthy lifestyle that he had allowed his brother-in-law to use him as a federal shield. I exposed how Marcus had planned to marry me today simply to use me as a naive scapegoat when the federal investigators inevitably came looking for the missing millions. The atmosphere in the megachurch was absolutely explosive. People were yelling, demanding answers from Reginald and Cecilia. The carefully constructed facade of the Sterling family had been violently ripped away, leaving nothing but a group of desperate, greedy criminals exposed in the harsh light of truth. I spoke over the rising chaos, my voice cutting through the noise with absolute authority. I welcomed everyone to the total liquidation of the Sterling empire. I announced that the freelance consultant from the south side of Chicago, the woman they had labeled a gold digger and a zero-asset addition, was actually the chief executive officer of Obsidian Capital. I told the entire congregation that my private equity firm had already purchased their $40 million debt and successfully seized controlling interest of their company. I looked down at Cecilia, whose eyes were wide with pure terror. I told the disgraced matriarch that she was sitting in a building that I technically controlled because I held the defaulted mortgage to the very church we were standing in. I reminded her that my firm owned the country club where they played golf and the land beneath their corporate headquarters. I told the screaming crowd that the Sterlings had claimed I brought no value to their family, but the truth was that my value was absolute because I literally owned them. The sanctuary was vibrating with pure chaos. Marcus was on his knees begging me to stop the presentation, begging me to remember our love. I ignored his pathetic cries and turned my attention to the front row where Camille was sitting paralyzed with shock. The entitled sister-in-law who had mocked my intelligence and laughed at my background was staring at the screens with tears streaming down her face. She turned to her husband, Bradley, demanding to know if he had really stolen the pension funds to save their lifestyle. Bradley held his hands up defensively, stuttering out pathetic excuses and blaming the massive theft on corporate pressure. He tried to tell Camille that he routed the money to the offshore accounts entirely for her benefit, so she would never have to give up her designer clothes and luxury vacations. I watched Bradley desperately trying to manipulate his wife into feeling grateful for his federal crimes, and I felt a cold, ruthless smile spread across my face. I leaned into the microphone and told Camille that she might want to look at the screens one last time before she decided to forgive her generous husband. I pressed the remote clicker, triggering the final and most devastating sequence of the presentation. The massive projectors clicked, loading a highly encrypted file that my cybersecurity team had pulled directly from Bradley's hidden digital vault. The banking ledgers faded away, replaced by a series of high-resolution photographs and digital receipts that had absolutely nothing to do with corporate investments or protecting the Sterling family wealth. The massive screens illuminated the dark church with clear, undeniable images of Bradley sitting at a luxury cafe in Paris, the exact same city he claimed to be visiting for a logistics conference last month. But he was not sitting with shipping executives or international investors. Bradley was sitting across from a stunning blonde woman, leaning across the table to kiss her passionately. The next slide showed a digital receipt from an exclusive diamond jeweler in the French capital, detailing the purchase of a $200,000 emerald-cut necklace. The receipt clearly displayed the shipping address for an upscale apartment in downtown Atlanta, an apartment that definitely did not belong to Camille. The photographs continued to cycle, showing Bradley and his secret mistress vacationing on a private yacht in the south of France and walking hand-in-hand out of a five-star hotel in Monaco. I spoke slowly, letting every single word land with devastating precision. I told the silent, gasping congregation that Bradley did not steal the union pension funds just to save the Sterling legacy or to buy his wife expensive dresses. He stole the life savings of hardworking families so he could fund an elaborate secret life with his mistress across the globe. I pointed out that the $4.2 million routed through the Cayman Islands were actively paying for luxury apartments, diamond necklaces, and private jets. While Camille was sitting at home completely clueless defending a man who was using her family as a personal bank account, the realization hit Camille like a physical blow. Her face contorted with a mixture of absolute heartbreak and unadulterated fury. She looked from the massive screens displaying her husband's infidelity down to the man standing nervously beside her. Bradley was completely trapped, his polished finance bro persona shattered into a million pieces. He reached out trying to grab Camille's arm, frantically shaking his head and babbling that the photos were taken out of context. He tried to claim it was just a misunderstanding, but the timestamps and the bank routing numbers displayed on the screens were absolute, undeniable proof of his betrayal. Camille let out a visceral, piercing scream that echoed through the vaulted ceilings of the mega church. It was the sound of a woman's entire reality collapsing in a single moment. She ripped her arm away from Bradley's grasp, her eyes burning with pure rage. The entire congregation held their breath, watching the destruction of the Sterling family reach its absolute boiling point. Camille did not hesitate or wait for Bradley to formulate another lie. She planted her feet firmly, squared her shoulders, and swung her hand with every ounce of strength she possessed. The sharp, violent crack of her palm connecting with Bradley's face sounded like a gunshot echoing off the marble pillars right there at the sacred altar in front of 500 members of Atlanta high society. Camille slapped her husband so hard he stumbled backward and crashed into the floral arrangements, scattering white roses across the carpet. I watched Bradley stumble into the massive arrangements of white lilies and orchids, sending the expensive flowers crashing down onto the polished marble steps of the altar. The sharp, echoing crack of Camille's hand striking his face seemed to paralyze the entire church for a fraction of a second. The elite members of Atlanta high society, the very same people who had spent their entire morning whispering vicious rumors about my character and reading blog posts calling me a scammer, were now completely speechless. They witnessing the absolute annihilation of the Sterling dynasty happening in real time, and none of them could look away from the carnage. My parents, Calvin and Josephine, were sitting in the second row watching the destruction with calm, dignified expressions. My mother did not smile or gloat. She simply nodded her head in silent approval, knowing that I was executing exactly what we had planned. My father sat tall in his tailored suit, knowing that the union workers back in Chicago and Atlanta were finally getting the justice they deserved against the executives who had tried to rob them blind. Elias, my corporate litigator, stood near the side aisle checking his encrypted tablet and waiting for the final phase of the operation to begin. I stood at the elevated marble pulpit, looking down at the absolute wreckage of the people who had tried to break my spirit. Marcus was still on his knees at the altar, weeping openly, his tears ruining the collar of his custom-tailored tuxedo. He kept reaching his hands toward the pulpit, pleading with me to turn off the screens, begging me to stop the presentation before the damage became permanent. He sobbed loudly, telling me that we could go to counseling, that we could fix the trust issues and still be a family. He was so completely delusional, so entirely insulated by his lifetime of privilege, that he actually believed a few tears and a pathetic apology could erase years of financial fraud and emotional manipulation. I gripped the microphone, ignoring Marcus completely. I looked out over the sea of shocked faces in the pews, scanning the crowd until I found the local news reporters and elite bloggers who had snuck into the back of the sanctuary trying to get exclusive coverage of the royal wedding. They were holding their phones up, recording every single second of the presentation, capturing the financial ledgers, the foreclosure notices, and the infidelity photos. Photos I knew that within minutes these videos would be uploaded to every major media platform in the country. The smear campaign they had launched against Obsidian Capital this morning was already dead buried under a mountain of undeniable, verified corporate fraud evidence. I leaned into the microphone one last time, my voice echoing through the massive speakers and bouncing off the stained glass windows. I told the congregation that the Sterling family had demanded I sign a prenuptial agreement because they believed I brought absolutely nothing to the table. I told them that today I had brought the truth, the federal authorities, and the absolute total liquidation of everything they held dear. I announced that the wedding was officially canceled, and the corporate takeover of Sterling Logistics was complete. I unplugged the silver flash drive from the podium, slipping the warm metal back into the palm of my hand, leaving the massive screens burning brightly with the evidence of their crimes, while the entire church descended into absolute, unmitigated chaos. The sanctuary of the historic Atlanta megachurch transformed instantly from a place of sacred, reverent worship into a chaotic arena of absolute social destruction. The moment the presentation ended, heavy, suffocating silence that had pressed down on the room completely shattered, replaced by a deafening roar of overlapping voices and sheer panic. 500 of the most influential and wealthy black elites in the city were all screaming at once. People were aggressively shoving their way out of the polished wooden pews, their expensive silk gowns, and custom-tailored suits, tangling together in the frantic rush to distance themselves from the Sterling family as fast as humanly possible. The incredibly powerful men and women who had spent the entire morning sipping mimosas at the country club and reading vicious blog posts about my background were now pulling out their mobile phones in absolute terror. I stood tall at the elevated marble pulpit, looking down at the congregation, and watched as dozens of wealthy investors frantically dialed their personal brokers, shouting desperate orders to immediately liquidate any and all shares they held in Sterling Logistics before the market fully registered the incoming federal indictments. The massive floral arrangements of imported white orchids and hydrangeas that Cecilia had spent of dollars to display were being trampled under the heavy leather shoes of her own fleeing guests. The illusion of the Sterling dynasty was burning to the ground in real time, and the toxic smoke was choking everyone who had dared to align themselves with Reginald and his corrupt empire. The elderly pastor who had been preparing to bless a marriage built entirely on federal fraud was now standing helplessly near the baptismal font, frantically waving his hands and shouting into a backup microphone, begging the congregation to maintain order and respect the sanctity of the church. But his voice was completely drowned out by the sheer volume of the scandal. Nobody cared about decorum or polite society rules anymore. They only cared about personal financial survival. The elite socialites who had reigned over Atlanta high society for decades were ruthlessly pushing each other out of the way, desperate to escape the blast radius of the absolute annihilation happening at the altar. Down at the front of the church, the situation was spiraling into a completely different kind of terrifying madness. Bradley, the arrogant white chief financial officer, who had spent the entire weekend mansplaining corporate finance to me, suddenly realized that his entire life was definitively over. He was standing in the middle of the crushed white lilies, staring at the massive projection screens that had just broadcast his offshore embezzlement and his secret French mistress to the entire city. The smug, polished exterior of the corporate finance bro was completely eradicated. His face was violently pale, covered in a thick layer of terrified sweat. His expensive designer tie was loosened and crooked, hanging uselessly around his neck, as he desperately tried to process the fact that his cryptocurrency tumblers and his Swiss bank accounts were permanently locked down by my cybersecurity team. Camille was still screaming at him, her voice hoarse and broken, completely humiliated by the undeniable proof of his serial infidelity. She lunged at him again, her hands curled into fists, tearing at the lapels of his custom jacket, but Bradley did not even try to apologize or defend his actions. The coward simply turned his back on his weeping wife and shoved her roughly aside. Bradley realized that the massive front doors of the megachurch were completely blocked by the frantic stampeding guests, so he frantically turned his attention toward the small, discreet wooden door near the choir loft. He sprinted across the polished marble floor of the altar, his expensive leather dress shoes slipping wildly on the scattered flower petals. He nearly crashed into the heavy brass communion railing, but he managed to catch his balance, breathing heavily like a hunted animal. He threw his full body weight against the heavy wooden side door, bursting into the narrow brick hallway that led to the private exit at the rear of the cathedral. He was running purely on adrenaline and raw panic, firmly believing that if he could just make it to his luxury sports car in the private parking lot, he could somehow reach the international airport and secure a flight out of the country before the authorities realized he was missing. But Bradley had vastly underestimated the absolute meticulous precision of my strategic planning. I had not just frozen his banking portals. I had actively coordinated with federal law enforcement, ensuring they had every single piece of digital evidence required to secure an immediate aggressive arrest warrant hours before the ceremony even began. Bradley pushed through the final set of heavy exit doors, bursting out into the warm, humid Atlanta afternoon, expecting to find the empty private parking lot waiting to facilitate his grand escape. Instead, he ran directly into a solid, unyielding wall of federal authority waiting patiently on the concrete landing. An entire specialized strike team of stern-faced Internal Revenue Service criminal investigators and armed United States federal marshals had completely locked down the perimeter of the church. They were wearing dark tactical vests with bold yellow lettering, holding their positions with absolute professional silence. Bradley froze in his tracks, his eyes darting frantically around the parking lot looking for a gap in their formation, but there was absolutely nowhere left to hide. The lead federal agent stepped forward, closing the distance between them. In 2 swift, aggressive strides, he did not bother reading Bradley his Miranda rights politely. He slammed the disgraced chief financial officer face first against the heavy stone wall of the historic church, the violent impact knocking the wind completely out of Bradley's lungs. The agent pulled Bradley's arms roughly behind his back, the sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs echoing loudly through the courtyard, locking securely around the wrists of the man who had just tried to steal the pensions of thousands of hard-working union laborers. The wealthy elite guests who had managed to escape through the front doors were now gathering around the wrought iron gates of the parking lot, holding up their mobile phones and recording every single second of the brutal, humiliating arrest. The untouchable white finance bro who thought he was smarter than everyone else in the room was being forcefully dragged away in chains right in front of the very same black elite society he had secretly exploited and despised. Back inside the chaotic sanctuary, Reginald was watching his entire world crumble into absolute dust. The powerful patriarch of the Sterling family was sitting heavily in the front wooden pew, his chest heaving as he realized his son-in-law was gone. His corporate empire was legally seized, and his blackmail attempt against my parents' community church had failed spectacularly. Reginald knew that the media cameras in the back of the room were capturing his complete destruction, and his fragile, arrogant ego simply could not handle the reality of being held accountable for his own massive failures in a final, pathetic attempt to manipulate the narrative and salvage whatever microscopic shred of sympathy he could gather from the fleeing guests. Reginald decided to play the absolute dirtiest and most cowardly card left in his deck. He suddenly let out a loud, dramatic gasp, clutching both of his hands tightly over the left side of his chest. He slumped heavily against the wooden backrest of the pew, his eyes rolling back in his head as he began to fake a massive, debilitating heart attack. He let out a series of strained, choking sounds, sliding dramatically off the cushion seat and collapsing onto the red-carpeted floor of the center aisle. Cecilia immediately began to scream hysterically, dropping to her knees beside her husband, crying out to the crowd, and begging someone to call an ambulance. The remaining guests gasped in horror, stepping back to give the fallen patriarch space, expecting a tragic medical emergency to pause the relentless exposure of their crimes. But I had anticipated Reginald's manipulative theatrics perfectly. I stood at the pulpit completely unfazed by his pathetic performance and raised my hand in a sharp, deliberate signal. Within seconds, a team of highly trained emergency medical technicians, wearing bright reflective uniforms, rushed through the side doors of the sanctuary. I had personally paid them a massive premium to remain on standby in the private holding room specifically for this exact moment. The paramedics pushed through the crowd, dropping their heavy medical bags right next to Reginald's trembling body. They worked with absolute clinical efficiency, ripping open his expensive dress shirt and immediately attaching a series of cold, sticky electrocardiogram sensors directly to his bare chest. Reginald kept his eyes squeezed tightly shut, continuing to let out weak, pathetic groans, while Cecilia held his hand and sobbed loudly for the cameras. The lead paramedic checked the glowing digital monitor of the portable medical machine, scanning the rhythm of the heartbeats traversing the screen. The paramedic stood up, looked down at the supposedly dying patriarch, and then turned to face the hushed, anxious congregation. He did not whisper or try to protect the dignity of the Sterling family, raised his voice so that every single person in the massive cathedral could hear him clearly. The paramedic announced with absolute medical certainty that Reginald's blood pressure was completely stable. His oxygen levels were perfect, and his heart rate was resting at a perfectly healthy 80 beats per minute. He loudly declared that the patriarch was experiencing absolutely zero signs of cardiac distress and was entirely faking the medical emergency. A collective groan of pure, utter disgust rippled through the entire church. The wealthy guests who had briefly felt a pang of sympathy for the fallen giant now looked down at him with unfiltered contempt. Reginald slowly opened his eyes, realizing his pathetic deception had been clinically exposed in front of everyone he respected. He lay there on the carpet, utterly humiliated, stripped of every single ounce of dignity he had ever possessed, while his wife stared at him in horrified silence. Down at the front of the altar, Marcus was still kneeling amid the crushed white lilies and the shattered remains of his perfect wedding day. He watched his father get exposed as a manipulative fraud, and he finally understood that there was absolutely no one left to protect him. Marcus crawled forward on his hands and knees, dragging himself up the first few marble steps of the pulpit until he was looking up at me. His handsome face was slick with tears and sweat, his custom tuxedo completely ruined by the chaos. He reached his hands toward me, sobbing with a desperate, pitiful intensity. He begged me to stop the destruction, pleading with me to remember the life we were supposed to build together. He cried out that we can fix this, that he loved me more than anything, and that he would do whatever I wanted if I just gave him one more chance. I stared down at the pathetic, cowardly man who had planned to use me as a naive scapegoat for his federal tax evasion. I did not feel a single drop of pity or sorrow looking at his tear-stained face. The love I once thought I held for him had been completely eradicated, replaced by a cold, unbreakable armor of absolute self-respect. I told Marcus that he did not love me. He only loved the comfortable delusion that he could control me and hide behind my innocence when his fraudulent world finally caught fire. I reached down and grasped the heavy platinum band of the 4-carat diamond engagement ring sitting on my left hand. I pulled the massive, sparkling stone off my finger, the cold metal slipping away with a definitive finality. I did not throw the ring at his face or hurl it across the massive sanctuary. I stepped down from the pulpit, closing the distance between us, and dropped the heavy diamond directly into the breast pocket of his ruined tuxedo jacket. I leaned in close and told him to keep the jewelry because his corporate accounts were permanently frozen, and he was going to need to pawn that exact diamond to afford a decent defense attorney when the federal marshals finally came to collect him. Marcus let out a shattered, agonizing sob, collapsing completely onto the marble stairs, the absolute finality of his ruin settling over him like a heavy shroud. But before I could turn my back and walk away from the destruction, I caught a sudden blur of aggressive emerald green moving rapidly in my peripheral vision. Cecilia had pulled herself up from the carpet beside her humiliated husband, her face twisted into a mask of pure, feral, unadulterated rage. She had lost her wealth, her social standing, her legacy, And now she was watching her golden child being discarded like trash at the altar. The disgraced matriarch let out a vicious, guttural scream, charging directly up the marble stairs toward me. With terrifying speed, she raised her heavy diamond-encrusted hand high into the air, fully intending to strike me across the face with every single ounce of vindictive fury she possessed. The heavy, diamond-encrusted hand never connected with my skin before Cecilia could even complete the violent arc of her aggressive swing. A strong, calloused hand reached out and caught her wrist directly in midair, stopping her furious momentum completely dead. My mother, Josephine, had moved from the second wooden pew with the lightning-fast reflexes of a woman who had survived the most dangerous and unforgiving neighborhoods in Chicago. She stood firmly between me and the disgraced matriarch, her posture radiating a calm, deadly power that absolutely dwarfed the frantic, erratic energy of the Sterling family. Josephine pushed Cecilia's arm backward with a sharp, effortless motion, her grip on the wealthy socialite's wrist acting like an iron vice. The stark contrast between the two women was a poetic masterpiece of social justice. Cecilia, wearing her aggressive, flashy, emerald green gown, completely consumed by her hollow, superficial entitlement, and my mother wearing a modest, perfectly tailored navy suit representing decades of quiet, dignified hard work. Josephine looked down at the self-proclaimed queen of Atlanta high society and delivered a devastating, quiet line that cut through the chaotic noise of the sanctuary like a sharpened blade. She told Cecilia that we Southside folks do not start fights, but we absolutely know how to end them. She released her grip, shoving the older woman away with a look of pure, unadulterated disgust. Disgust. Cecilia lost her footing on the polished marble steps of the altar, stumbling awkwardly backward and crashing heavily into the very same wooden pew she had been sitting in just moments ago. Her expensive silk gown twisted around her legs, and the elaborate updo she had spent hours perfecting at the salon completely unraveled, leaving her looking like a terrified, disheveled stranger, rather than the untouchable president of the local heritage board. The elite women in the surrounding pews, the very same sorority sisters, who had blindly followed Cecilia's arrogant commands for decades, actually physically recoiled from her, pulling their expensive skirts away as if her sudden catastrophic failure was a contagious disease. They whispered furiously behind their programs, already working to excommunicate the fallen matriarch from their exclusive social circles. No one extended a hand to help her up. No one offered a word of comfort because in the ruthless world of high society, loyalty only existed as long as the bank accounts remained full. I stepped down from the elevated marble pulpit, the heavy weight of the microphone gone from my hands, replaced by an overwhelming sense of profound liberation. My mother and father instantly flanked me on either side, creating an impenetrable wall of absolute fierce support. The massive crowd of elite guests, who had been screaming and shoving each other just moments before, suddenly fell entirely silent as I approached the center aisle. They parted for us like the Red Sea, stepping back and pressing their bodies tightly against the wooden pews to clear a wide, unobstructed path. Nobody dared to speak to me. Nobody dared to challenge the woman who had just publicly liquidated one of the most powerful and feared families in the entire city. I walked down the long carpeted aisle, the heavy French lace and imported silk train of my $25,000 custom Vera Wang gown, dragging softly across the floor behind me, brushing over the crushed petals of the ruined floral arrangements. I held my head high, making direct eye contact with the wealthy investors and corporate leaders who were standing frozen in the aisles. I saw the profound shift in their expressions. The condescending sneers from the rehearsal dinner had been completely erased, replaced by a very clear and undeniable look of deep-seated fear and immense respect. They finally understood that the freelance consultant from the South Side was actually a financial apex predator, and I had just swallowed the entire Sterling dynasty whole. I did not look back at Marcus, who was still on his knees sobbing uncontrollably into his hands, mourning the loss of his lavish lifestyle. I did not look at Reginald, who was lying on the floor recovering from his fake medical emergency, staring blankly at the vaulted ceiling as he realized his legacy was permanently eradicated, and I certainly did not look at Cecilia, who was quietly weeping in the front row as her entire social empire crumbled into dust around her. As we reached the heavy wooden double doors at the back of the massive cathedral, Elias, my corporate litigator, pushed them open, allowing the bright, warm Atlanta sunlight to flood into the dark, chaotic sanctuary. I stepped out onto the grand stone steps of the megachurch, and the immediate explosion of camera flashes nearly blinded me. The scene outside the church was a landscape of absolute media pandemonium. News vans with massive satellite dishes were parked aggressively along the curb, and dozens of reporters were conducting frantic live television stand-ups directly on the front lawn. The paparazzi and the local journalists who had spent the entire morning dragging my name through the mud and calling me a fraudulent gold digger were swarming the bottom of the stairs, pushing aggressively against the metal barricades. They were screaming my name, shouting frantic questions about the corporate takeover, the federal injunctions, and the highly publicized arrest of the chief financial officer. I paused at the top of the stairs, letting the cameras capture the triumphant image of the bride who had just dismantled a corrupt empire from the inside out. I did not stop to answer a single one of their desperate inquiries. I did not need to offer any public statements or defend my character because the truth was currently manifesting right in front of their rolling cameras. Just across the courtyard, near the private side exit of the sanctuary, a team of heavily armed federal marshals and IRS criminal investigators were forcefully escorting Bradley toward a waiting black sport utility vehicle. The arrogant white finance bro who had constantly mansplained basic economics to me and laughed at my background was now completely stripped of his unearned superiority. His tailored suit jacket was rumpled, his expensive silk tie was gone, and his hands were secured tightly behind his back in heavy steel handcuffs. The media cameras immediately pivoted away from me, capturing the absolute humiliation of the corrupt executive being loaded into the back of a federal transport vehicle. The news reporters were shouting into their microphones, confirming to the live television audience that the embezzlement allegations were entirely factual and the federal raid on Sterling Logistics headquarters was currently underway, across town. The vicious smear campaign that Bradley had launched against Obsidian Capital was officially dead, buried under a mountain of undeniable digital evidence and highly visible federal indictments. The narrative had shifted with whiplash-inducing speed. The morning headlines calling me a desperate scammer had already been replaced by breaking news banners, praising the brilliant, anonymous private chief executive who had exposed a massive corporate fraud ring, saving the pensions of thousands of working-class union employees. My father stepped forward and opened the heavy armored door of my waiting chauffeur, Maybach extending his hand to help me maneuver the massive layers of silk and tulle into the spacious leather back seat. My mother slid in beside me, her face glowing with a quiet, immense pride. Elias climbed into the front passenger seat, his encrypted tablet already glowing with live market updates. The driver smoothly pulled the luxury vehicle away from the chaotic scene at the church, navigating through the throng of reporters and turning onto the main avenue heading toward the downtown financial district. The tinted windows of the Maybach shielded us from the frantic world outside, wrapping us in a cocoon of absolute silence and profound victory. I leaned back against the plush leather headrest and let out a long, slow breath, feeling the residual adrenaline slowly bleeding out of my veins. Elias turned around in his seat, a rare, genuine smile breaking through his normally ruthless, professional demeanor. He tapped the screen of his tablet and read the live financial reports aloud, confirming that the massive public exposure of the Sterling's crimes had completely exonerated my firm. Elias explained that the moment the federal agents arrested Bradley and the digital evidence was verified by the authorities, the stock value of Obsidian Capital had instantly rebounded, erasing the morning losses entirely and surging to record-breaking heights. Our investors, who had been panicking and threatening a vote of no confidence just a few hours ago, were now sending desperate, groveling emails begging for my forgiveness and pledging their absolute, unconditional loyalty to my leadership. Elias confirmed that the 51% proxy voting rights had been fully integrated into the federal corporate registry, making my ownership of Sterling Logistics absolutely ironclad. We had not just survived the vicious, coordinated attack from the Atlanta elite. We had executed a flawless hostile takeover, secured the stolen union pension funds, and permanently removed a family of corrupt predators from the financial ecosystem. I looked out the window, watching the towering skyscrapers of the Atlanta skyline passing by. They were no longer just buildings belonging to a closed-off, exclusionary society of old money legacy families. They were monuments in a city that I had just conquered through sheer intellect and unwavering determination. My mother reached over and gently squeezed my hand, her touch grounding me, bringing me back to the reality of what we had accomplished together. There, she reminded me that we did not just win a boardroom battle today. We had protected our community, we had secured the livelihoods of the men and women who broke their backs in the shipping yards, and we had proven that no amount of generational wealth or country club status could ever defeat the unbreakable, resilient spirit of the South Side. I rested my head against the cool glass of the window, closing my eyes and allowing the immense satisfaction of the perfect revenge to wash over my entire soul. The House of Sterling had completely fallen, and a new, undisputed empire had risen from the ashes. The ride through the city felt completely different now. The streets that had seemed so hostile and unwelcoming just a few days ago now felt like conquered territory. I thought about the rehearsal dinner, the arrogant smirks on the faces of the guests who had judged me for my modest background. They had assumed my silence was a symptom of weakness, a sign that I was intimidated by their immense wealth and their deep-rooted social connections. They failed to understand that a true apex predator never announces its presence before striking. I had sat at that table enduring their pathetic insults and their desperate attempts at psychological manipulation, all while holding the absolute power to legally eradicate their entire existence with a single phone call. The prenuptial agreement they had slid across the table to protect their non-existent fortune felt like a distant, hilarious memory, now a profound symbol of their staggering delusion. My father, Calvin, looked at me from across the spacious cabin of the Maybach, his eyes reflecting a deep understanding of the journey we had just completed. He told me that for decades he had watched executives like Reginald and Bradley sit in their glass towers, making decisions that destroyed the lives of the working-class families operating the supply chains. They treated the warehouse workers and the truck drivers as disposable numbers on a spreadsheet, completely devoid of basic human empathy. My father said that watching me stand at the pulpit and dismantle that corrupt hierarchy gave a voice to every single laborer who had ever been silenced by the greed of the corporate elite. We had not just protected my legacy, we had fundamentally shifted the balance of power, handing the company back to the very people who actually built it. Elias interrupted the quiet moment, tapping his screen again to report that the local news networks were now running continuous live coverage of the fallout. Aerial helicopters were broadcasting footage of federal agents carrying dozens of boxes of financial records out of the Sterling corporate headquarters. The news anchors were reading direct quotes from the union representatives who were publicly praising Obsidian Capital for stepping in and halting the catastrophic theft of their retirement funds. The narrative was completely cemented. I was no longer the outsider trying to infiltrate their ranks. I was the brilliant visionary who had purged a historic sickness from the Atlanta business community. The complete and utter destruction of the Sterling family was absolute. Their names would forever be synonymous with greed, betrayal, and spectacular failure. I finally looked down at my hands. The left ring finger was completely bare. The heavy diamond that had represented a fraudulent promise was gone, leaving only a faint indentation on my skin. I felt no sorrow for the loss of Marcus. The man I thought I loved had never actually existed. He was simply a carefully constructed mirage, a weak, hollow facade designed to lure me into a trap so his family could use my resources to cover their crimes. Dropping that ring into his pocket was the most liberating action I had ever taken, cutting the final toxic thread that tied me to their poisonous dynasty. I was stepping into a new chapter of my life, completely unburdened, completely victorious, and wielding more corporate power than anyone in the city could possibly comprehend. The war was definitively over. The absolute takedown was complete, and the future belonged entirely to me. The greatest lesson from this story is that your true value is absolutely never determined by arrogant people who judge you based on your background or where you grew up. True power does not come from marrying into a wealthy family or seeking validation from elite social circles. It comes from believing in your own intelligence, building your own empire from scratch, and protecting your peace. You should never shrink yourself to fit into rooms where you are not respected when toxic people try to build a cage around you. Simply have the courage to buy the building and leave. If you have ever had to stand your ground against toxic people, let me know in the comments and hit subscribe for more stories of sweet revenge.